I'm talking about here is generally called the Wes Wise Incident. Wes Wise was a media person, a television. I think his main topic was sports. I think he did other things. I think he eventually became the mayor of Dallas, if I don't have that wrong. But he's in the Wes Wise Incident. He's kind of a middleman who helped to screw up the details of it and make it kind of a complex topic to explain, but I'm going to do my best to explain it. This is from an FBI report, and I think I'll do some reading. Mr. Wes Wise, Sports Department, KRLD TV was interviewed, at which time he furnished the following information. Mr. Wise said on December 4th, 1963, he made a talk before the Oak Cliff Exchange Club at a luncheon meeting at the El Chico restaurant in Oak Cliff. Wise, although his specialty is sports, eventually the conversation at the meeting got around to the assassination of the president, since persons present knew Wise was associated with KRLD-TV, the CBS outlet in Dallas. Wise continued that at the conclusion of the meeting, one of the guests came forward and reluctantly volunteered information that on November 22nd, 1963, just after the news had been broadcast of the president's assassination, he observed a red 1957 Plymouth four-door sedan proceeding west at a rapid rate of speed on Davis Street in Oak Cliff. Wise said his source stated after a short period of time this car returned to the parking lot at the El Chico restaurant, where the car parked beside the restaurant and the occupant remained in the car. The source told Wise because of the mysterious maneuverings of this car, he walked close to the car and determined the license plate number was PP4537. The source told Wise at the luncheon meeting that evening, while observing TV, a picture of Oswald was shown, and the source recognized Oswald as being the individual he observed in the red 1957 Plymouth on that afternoon. Wise said, as he recalled, this occurred on the same corner where Oswald reportedly left a taxicab following his trip from downtown Dallas. Wise also said he had checked the license plate PP4537 through the License Bureau, and it was ascertained this license was issued to Carl Amos Mather, 4309 Colgate Lane, Garland, Texas. So this is an Oswald sighting that is particularly credible as being significant because the license plate, which the witness wrote down and showed to Wise, the license plate belonged to Carl Amos Mather, who was a good friend of J.D. Tippit, who had just been murdered down the street from this location. So that is just an incredible coincidence. It's too much to be a coincidence. There has to be some relationship of this incident to the killing of Tippit, and Oswald is the one who's supposedly driving this car, and it's near where apparently the story of Whaley, it's near where Whaley let off Oswald too. So this is very suggestive that it really was Oswald driving the car. And Mather wasn't just a casual acquaintance of the Tippits. He and Tippit had lived on the same street, across the street a few houses down. They both moved from this location in November of 1961 to new houses. But the relationship continued, and on the day that Tippit was killed, both of the Mathers, with their children, went over to the Tippit house to console Marie and the family there. So the Tippits and the Mathers go back several years and apparently were fairly close friends. And Carl Mather's license plate was seen on a car driven by Lee Harvey Oswald near the scene of Tippit's murder. That is a little too much to accept as coincidence. So the story at this point in the telling is that Oswald, or someone who looks like him, was spotted in a red 1957 Plymouth at the El Chico restaurant, which is very close to where Tippit was shot. The time isn't defined very well in this, but it certainly has to be after Tippit was shot, because the police are in the neighborhood busily doing something, according to the story, and that would be after Tippit had been shot. Now, the first curveball that comes in this story is that the Mathers do own a 1957 Plymouth with that license plate on it, but it's not a red Plymouth, it's a two-tone blue Plymouth. So the story coming from Wes Wise has this as a red 1957 Plymouth with the Mathers license plate on it, but the Mathers own a blue 1957 Plymouth. But when we finally hear from the actual witness, not through Wes Wise, but from the actual witness, Mr. T.F. White, a mechanic at Mac Pate's garage, we find out that the red Plymouth is actually a red Ford. Mr. White stated he saw the red car at approximately 2 p.m. And remember, this is the FBI talking, they're not quoting White, so I'm not sure about this time, on the parking lot of the El Chico restaurant. He stated he now believes the car to have been a red 1961 Falcon, and he believed the automobile had 1963 Texas license PP4537. White said he observed the man driving the car from the side of his face, and when he saw television pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald on the night of November 22, 1963, he believed the man he saw at the El Chico restaurant parking lot was identical with Oswald. He said the man sat in the car for a short period of time and then left at a high rate of speed going down West Davis Ave, I think it's West Davis Ave, or Davis Street, whatever. Now, the FBI here makes it sound as if White is changing his story. He says that he now believes the car to have been a red 1961 Falcon. But the reason I think that it was thought that it was a Plymouth is because Wes Wise had checked with the Registry of Motor Vehicles, or whatever it was called, and they told him that it was a Plymouth because it was from the Carl Mather Plymouth. They didn't give a color of the car, but White had told Wise that it was red, and the registry told Wise that it was a Plymouth. So Wise is telling the FBI that it's a red Plymouth, and so White didn't change the story. Wes Wise got it screwed up, because the witness isn't going to think it's a blue car and then he'll think it was a red car. Of course not. He's not an idiot. He's a mechanic. He works on cars. He probably said it. If he said it was any kind of, he may not have given the make to Wes Wise, but when he gives the plate to Wes Wise, he checks on what the plate's supposed to be. He finds out the plate is for a Plymouth, and White told him it was red, so he's got it as a red Plymouth. That, I think, is the source of some of the confusion here, and I don't think the FBI wants to clear that up. I think they want to make it look like White changed his story. And this here is a picture of a red 1961 Ford Falcon. It's a very different looking car from a 1957 Plymouth, especially if the Plymouth is blue. And if we look at these two cars together, remember, these aren't the actual cars, but these are a 57 Plymouth blue, two-tone blue, and a 61 Ford Falcon red. And if you think that Mechanic White thought first it was the car on top and then afterwards changed his story to the car on bottom, then you're in the wrong hobby here. You should go get yourself another hobby. Of course he didn't make that mistake. This is something that Wes Wise screwed up because he went to the license bureau and, and this mistake is still haunting people. John Armstrong, I think he's corrected it now, but until a few years ago anyway, he was still calling this thing a blue Plymouth, when I think clearly, if you understand the evidence, you have to say it was a red Ford with a Plymouth license plate on it, or with a license plate on it that belonged on a blue Plymouth. A red Ford with a license plate that belonged on Carl Mather's blue Plymouth. That's what Mechanic White reported. And And I think that's what he said all along. He didn't change his story. Now, the FBI conducted a very flawed investigation of this automobile and its license plate. For one thing, they talked to Mrs. Mather, but they didn't talk to Mr. Mather. They didn't talk to the owner of the car. They talked to his wife. And apparently this is because they went by the Mather home during business hours and Carl was at work. Apparently it didn't occur to them that they could go to Carl's job at Collins Radio and interview him there. They would rather have talked to Mrs. Mather. And this is from a report of that interview. Mrs. Mather stated on November 22nd, 1963, her husband left his work at Collins Radio Company in Richardson, Texas at approximately 2 or 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon, at which time he came to their home at 4309 Colgate Avenue, Garland, Texas. Mrs. Mather stated she and her husband were friends of former Dallas policeman J.D. Tippit, who was shot on the afternoon of November 22, 1963. Mrs. Mather said shortly after her husband arrived home, they took their 2 children with them in their 1954 Ford station wagon, at which time they proceeded to Dallas, Texas, to the Tippit home to express their condolences to Mrs. Tippit and to assist her in any way possible. Mrs. Mather said she and her husband and the children remained at the Tippit home together until around 5 p.m. They arrived at the Tippit home at approximately 3:30 p.m. that afternoon. Around 5 p.m., Mr. Mather left the Tippit home with the 2 Mather children and drove to the Mather home in Garland, where he fed the 2 children and put them to bed. Mrs. Mather was questioned as to knowledge of her husband or anyone else driving a red late-model automobile in the vicinity of El Chico restaurant on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, at which time Mrs. Mather stated she was at a loss to understand any connection between the red automobile, reportedly bearing Texas license BP 4537, and her family. Mrs. Mather said, as best as she could recall, her husband was at the Tippit home constantly on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, following their arrival there at about 3:30 p.m. So notice that it's never stated in this FBI report where the Plymouth was. It's Mrs. Mather says that they took the 1950 Ford station wagon when they went to visit the Tippits. Mrs. Mather says that Mr. Mather came home around 2:30 from work, but doesn't say what car he was driving. There's no mention whatsoever of the Plymouth in this. And of course the question is, or should be, where was the Plymouth? The car that has the license plate that was seen on another car near the Tippit murder. Or where was that car at that time? This question is never asked, or if it's asked, it's never reported in the FBI report. And this is not credible. The FBI are professional investigators. They can't be so stupid as to not be curious as to where the car was, the car whose license plate was seen. Here they talk about a red car. Apparently they're asking Mrs. Mather whether she drove a red car or whether her husband drove a red car. But they avoid asking any specific questions about the 1957 Plymouth. And that's the question they have to ask. Where was that car? They never ask where it was. They could have lent it out to somebody, and this story would not be incorrect. They could have lent it out to Lee Harvey Oswald, and this story would not be incorrect. I'm not saying they did that. I don't know. But that car could have been anywhere, according to this story, because it's not mentioned. And that's the whole point. That's what they're investigating. Why was the license plate of this car seen on a car near the Tippit murder? So you got to ask where that car was, but they never do. And if you're watching this on YouTube, this is the end of part 1.